thanks Nazneen very much, and thanks to Society for Asian Art, and thank all of you for coming. The talk today is related to a project that I've been working on for a while that some of you know about, a little bit about, I think, and that is this exhibition proposal. We're hoping to do this exhibition in 2.5 or 3 years. It would be a joint project with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. Laura Weinstein, who's my sort of opposite number there. Actually, the idea originated with her. And when I heard about it, I said, oh, Laura, let's work together on this and see if we can do it. So we've been working together for a little over a year on it. And we're hoping, cross your fingers for us, that we can apply for an NEH grant later this year and really get the ball rolling. The talk today is not about the themes of the proposed exhibition per se. It's more about how do we look at artworks that depict dance. When I dived into this a year and some months ago, I thought it was pretty straightforward. I thought, a painting of dance, a sculpture of dance. But as I've been learning, it's not straightforward, and there's a lot of scholarly and theoretical writing on dance iconography and how we think about the depictions of dance in static mediums like painting and sculpture. So that's the subject for today. Now, I want to show you a video. It's 1 minute and 7 seconds, and it will seem unrelated, but it is going to be related. So what that is a little excerpt from this Matthew Bourne dance. He's the choreographer. This is a little excerpt. I urge you to go to YouTube and watch the rest of it. It's wonderful and hilarious all the way through. Now, what does this have to do with the subject? Well, first of all, it's dance that's about something else. It's about men's underwear advertising, right? That's what it's about. So it's a dance that's about some completely other subject. Here we go. This is what we're talking about, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, men's underwear advertising. And it raises some questions that I want to try to get at a little bit today, and it also raises some other questions that are really important, but that I want to leave for another time. So one is what I just said: dance that's about some other activity, and here it is about posing for a men's underwear advertisement, and then there's the interaction of dance with a static art, namely advertising design and photography. So dance is relating itself to a static artistic form. And as we'll see later on, this goes back and forth, of course. Dancers are looking at paintings and sculptures all the time, and painters and sculptors are looking at dancers all the time, and so there's ideas and forms and so on going back and forth between performed dance and static visual arts, like painting and sculpture. And then, then the two in brackets, I want to come back to another day because there's not time for today. But one is obviously that part of what's going on here is that this is a dance that's parodying, gently, charmingly parodying something. So and the music, straight 19th century ballet music, also being kind of parodied by being charmingly, affectionately being parodied by being attached to this, the he-men doing their posing for their underwear ads. So this is a dance that's knowing about the traditions of dance, the history of dance. It's self-conscious about the history of dance. And that happens, of course, often enough in Western traditions and Asian traditions too, that dancers do something that refers to something earlier in the history of dance. And some of the audience won't get it, but some of the audience will recognize these references, these analogies, these quotations, and will get it. And then, of course, the erotic, very important in dance all over the world, and unavoidable, and part of the pleasure of dance always for us. I don't know if you could see it, but if you watch it on YouTube, you'll be able to see better. At the beginning, when one of the dancers, one of the underwear models, puts his arm on the shoulder of the other and sort of whispers into his ear, the one that is hearing this smiles ever so slightly. So there's some little erotic byplay or some little secret or something that's being shared. And then a few seconds later, when somebody else sort of whispers into the ear of another one of the dancers, underwear models, he looks very sort of put out. And then one of the dancers, the dancer who put his arm on his hand on the shoulder of another dancer, that dancer kind of pulls away. And then that dancer goes, the dancer who put his hand there, goes and finds another dancer who's happy to have the hand of the first dancer on his shoulder. So watch it again from the point of view of the sort of erotic byplay, because very fundamental to dance traditions all over the world. Now, a basic question is, when we see a sculpture or a painting that might be of dance, is it about dance? Is it a dancer? Is it dance going on? Tough to say sometimes. I mean, it seems like a straightforward question, but in fact, as I hope I'll convince you today, it's not at all a straightforward question. Here's this more than 4,000-year-old famous Indus Valley little bronze sculpture of what is always called a dancer. Well, how do we know it's a dancer? I mean, we have no evidence about dance from 2500 BCE. We're using 19th century or 20th century eyes and presumptions to say this must be a dancer. It certainly could be a dancer, but how do we know that in fact, could be something else? I doubt that it's a fashion model, but the underlying question is, how do we know we're seeing dance if we think we might be? This raises a basic question that I've put in brackets because I'm not going to address it, okay? The question of what dance is too complicated and too controversial and too uncertain. So I urge you, and for today, just going to use a kind of common sense understanding that, we know it when we see it, even though it may be hard to identify. But then there's the question of what do even we include in dance? What about ice dancing? Is ice dancing dance? Do we think of ice dancing as dance? Well, I don't know. What about water ballet, synchronized swimming, and so on? Is it dance? And if it's not, why isn't it? That's the question. I mean, for any of these, if we say, no, that's not dance, then we need to be prepared to explain why it isn't dance. Then I wanted to show you, I have a run of slides and I'll go through them quickly, a whole bunch of ordinary human activities that if you saw them in a photograph or a drawing or a painting or even a sculpture, you might think they're dance, but who knows? So what about any of these figures? If you saw them cold, could you swear that they weren't dancers in the process of a dance? I mean, all of this is modeling. All of this is fashion model shoots. But if you saw it cold and not in the pages of a fashion magazine, why wouldn't these be dance? And then making speeches, 19th century books on how to make a speech, and so on. And if you look at the pictures of the national speech-making contests for high school students and college students, you see plenty of gestures that might perfectly well be dance. And then if you look at our national leaders of India and of the United States, I mean, why aren't they dancing? If we saw these pictures, how do we know that this isn't dance? And then, of course, calisthenics. If you see a still picture of it, how do you know it isn't dance? Or acrobatics. This is an Indian village tradition of acrobatics. I don't think I could make up a definition of dance that would exclude this from dance, so why isn't this dance? And then gymnastics, plenty, of course, that looks like dance or could look like dance. Yoga looks perfectly well like dance a lot of the time. And then all kinds of sports. I mean, why isn't that dancing? Except that it's a frozen moment in time that some lucky photographer happened to get. And then a very important one is martial arts. Why aren't these manifestations dance? And maybe they are. And there's lots of dance in the world, lots of dance in India, lots of dance in Southeast Asia, lots of dance in the areas of the world that we're focusing on today that are related to battle dance or fighting dance or conquering somebody or getting yourself revved up to go into battle. So what about the connections between martial arts and dance? And then probably a very, very, very fundamental and important one, what about the connections between dance and religious ritual, where carrying the Torah scrolls or doing something with a mandala and vajra and bell, or lustrating an image, or elevating the host. These are programmed, stylized, designed, repeated, practiced physical gestures in space. So why aren't they dance, or how do we distinguish them from dance? And of course, in India and Southeast Asia, there's lots of connections between religious ritual and dance. Then there's the question of of farmers dancing and farmers dance, I'm calling it here. On the top is Thai countryside farmers dancing. These are farm women who are dancing. So these are village women, farm women who are doing a dance. And then down below them is a tourist farmer dance that you see in a fancy restaurant, or you go to a theater and see. So what about the dances that farmers do versus the dancers that professional dancers do, imitating or kind of imitating or referring to the down-home real original dance? What about that? That's complicated to sort out sometimes. And then dance that's about other activities. Here the Indian dancer, what's she doing? Yeah, she's putting on her makeup and checking her hair and looking at herself in the mirror. So the dancer is, in this instance, kind of miming another activity that we can recognize. These, what looks like a tennis game is another dance by Matthew Bourne, and it takes place on a tennis court. And the dancers are dressed up like tennis players. You can find this online too if you want to. It's fantastic. And they're lobbing the invisible ball back and forth, and at the end they, the winners jump over the net, and they do the whole thing, but it's dance instead of tennis playing, but it's on a tennis court, and they're miming playing tennis. So the idea that dance refers to, imitates, parodies, mimes, other kinds of activities is a very basic and important one. And back to something mentioned a minute ago, think about the dance that's about fighting, the Sharks and the Jets in West Side Story, or in plenty of classical dance from Southeast Asia and India too, about battles in the Ramayana. Here's I think this is Lakshmana and Indrajit fighting. So plenty of dance that is imitating or reenacting fighting of various kinds. And this brings up a question, a fundamental one, about photography and how we are used to thinking about photography. When you look at 19th century photographs of dancers and dance going on, it's never really dance. It's always posed because the cameras weren't fast enough and advanced enough to be able to stop motion. So the ballerina or the Indian dancer has to strike a pose out of their dance repertoire and hold it long enough for the photographer to photograph it with a 19th century camera. Nowadays, of course, it's easy enough for a photographer to use an advanced camera and flash, maybe, to do a stop motion. But I suspect you can tell in this pair which one, I know for a fact, one of these is posed and one of these is actually a clip I made from a video. And I bet everybody can tell which is which, right? Which is the posed one? Yeah. So, but looking at this, if you saw that one by itself, it's important to think to yourself, this is not dance going on. This is dancers having struck a pose for a photographer. So this is not actually a moment in dance. That one is a moment in dance, but this one is not a moment in dance. Now, how do artists give us a clue that they're representing dancing? Well, there's a bunch of ways that I've been thinking about in Indian and Southeast Asian and Himalayan art. One that comes up often is a leg is raised way up off the ground. And I'm just talking about formal things now. I'm not talking about the iconography for the moment. I'm just talking about the formal qualities of the positioning and the pose and so on. So it seems that often one leg raised high off the ground signals to us that dance is going on. But even with the Shiva Nataraja of this kind, there's scholarly disagreement in India and the rest of the world too about whether we understand Shiva to have reached this pose and frozen for a moment in this pose, or we're seeing just an instant in an ongoing flow of movement. So even with one like this, there's some disagreement. Lots of different kinds of figures standing with one leg raised, and we take it to be dance. In this instance, the artist has done something else interesting, which is to put the figure off axis relative to the base. So that suggests a kind of dynamism of balance and movement and so on, and does not suggest a static pose. Then Krishna, of course, we see baby Krishna dancing. We presume dancing, it's understood to be dancing, signaled by one leg raised up off the ground and the position of the arms too. Or in our own collection, the overcoming the demon Kaliya, this repeated form of raising one leg high off the ground. In Cambodian reliefs, same thing. Apsaras is shown as we presume dancing, and this is symbolized for us by their raising one leg far up off the ground. Something that you may notice in most of the Indian ones that we've seen so far, the leg is at a kind of halfway up. Here and in some more that we'll see in a minute, it's tucked all the way, as tight as can be, up underneath the thighs or the buttocks. A Southeast Asian one, a tantric Hindu deity from Cambodia. So over and over and over and over and over, we're seeing dance suggested by one leg up, and of course this is a position that dancers assume themselves a lot. Then another one that it seems to me is a frequent clue is foot raised and toe pointed towards the ground. Just a little heel raise and toe down. And it comes up a lot. And with these dancing Ganeshas, for instance, this one from our own collection, it's a little uncertain whether we're seeing dance in process or we're seeing a pose, but it seems like often that this heel up, toe pointed posture is meant to signal dance for us. Needless to say, Indian and Southeast Asian artists gloried in the challenge of showing a elephant-headed dwarf dancing. Great fun to work on. Heel up, toe down, pointed. But also occurring in very, very, very serious contexts, a ferocious goddess who, as you can see, has this heel up, toe pointed down posture here. And it happens a lot with sets of goddesses who are in sometimes furious motion. And of course, obviously, you see it in Indian dance a lot too. I've purposely, this is from a Wikipedia page, and I've purposely left some of the text to remind myself and you that it's a Wikipedia page, because the point is, you know, the writer of this article is saying, look, this sculpture is doing this. It's, of course, the other way around. This dancer is doing that. You know, we have artworks from much earlier than we have very precise information about dance. Now, from 1500 years ago, we have the Natya Shastra, this great text on Indian dance, and it outlines 108 positions or movements and so on and so on. But there's great complexity and controversy over interpreting what they actually meant in the dancer's body and so on. So, and what we now think of as the classical traditions of Indian dance, as maybe you know and have heard me say before, they were reinvented in the 1920s and the 1930s. They don't survive from ancient times. During the 18th century, and particularly the 19th century colonial period, dance had been frowned upon by the Brits and by a lot of well-to-do Indians as being associated with prostitution and poor people and kind of low life and so on. So it was a very low prestige and to be avoided. And Indians, self-conscious, distinguished Indians didn't want to be associated with dance because it had all of these bad associations. And it was only in the 19-teens and 20s that there was a quite purposeful recreation of the dance as a concert art, as something that you buy a ticket for and go to a theater and watch it rather than seeing it in the village or seeing it in the temple or seeing it in a restaurant kind of thing. Often earlier, dance had been primarily located in the temple or in village traditions or in the courts. As troops of dancers who performed for the Maharaja, but reinvented in the teens and 20s as a high art concert form. Now, how else do artists let us know, or how else do we know that we're seeing dance? Well, sometimes the story is clear. And so if you recognize the story, then you know that the story is about dancing. And this is an example like that. Kali has kind of gotten out of control, and there are her other ferocious women with her, and they're kind of out of control too. She's been destroying evil and so on, but she gets revved up and she gets going, and nobody can stop her, and she's causing too much disruption in the world. So Shiva is appealed to overcome her somehow and get her settled down, so that the disruptions that she's causing will get tamped down. So Shiva invites her to a dance competition, and they have a dance competition between them. And I don't think you could tell that from this painting, but given that the story is well known, you know the story, so therefore we can interpret what's going on here. There's two versions of how the story comes out. In one version, Shiva is simply a better dancer and wins because he's a better dancer. In another version of the story, he kind of cheats. He uses a sort of a stratagem. He lifts one leg up all the way up like this, and the texts say that he puts it back here, his leg he puts back here, so he lifts it all the way up like that, and Kali can't do it because it would be immodest. So he wins by doing something that a man can do that a woman can't do in modesty. Here's a story we know. So the artist doesn't have to go very far in telling us that this is dance going on, because this is a known story that most everybody would recognize. Even though, I mean, if you saw that figure isolated, would you necessarily know that it was dancing as opposed to just gesturing or whatever? But the story is known, therefore we can gather that it's dancing. What about this one, which is the same story? Might be dancing, but might just be gesturing in some way, this figure. So in this instance, I think, without knowing the story and knowing that the story is about dancing, we might not be certain that this figure is in fact dancing. Or these figures, which don't appear in particular to be dancing at all, except we know that they are the daughters of the demon Mara, who are sent to dance before the Prince Siddhartha and distract him or seduce him away from being able to achieve enlightenment. So we know they're dancing from the story, even though the artistic depiction doesn't necessarily make it look very much like dancing. Here's another representation of the same scene, and I don't know if you can. Let's see. This is a detail of the, thank you. Maybe easier to do with my hand. That's a detail of this part, and you probably can't see it very well, but there are several figures, female figures, who are the daughters of Mara, and there's no doubt that they're dancing. And anyway, we would know it from the story. Then, would we know that this figure is dancing specifically as opposed to making a gesture, or the gesture of one foot behind the other in this way? We see a lot in Indian art, but it's the goddess of dance. So the goddess of dance has to be dancing. So because we know who it is, we can be confident that we're seeing dancing, even if it's not entirely clear from the depiction itself. Then another clue that comes up a lot is just, these are all kind of simple-minded, the presence of musical instruments. When there's lots of drums and musical instruments around, that's a clue that it's probably dancing. And certainly in this instance, the figure of Krishna doesn't obviously seem to us to be dancing, but we know he is because of the presence of the musical instruments. And then this one, see, there's a drummer here, there's another musician here, so there are several small musicians accompanying this figure, without whom I think we wouldn't be sure that this figure was dancing at all. It's the presence of the drummers and other musicians that give us the clue. Here's an obvious one. There's a figure playing a harp, accompanying the dancer. So clearly we're seeing dance. Then sometimes it's the setting that tells us that dance is going on. Here's a court, a royal court, and the court dancers have been called in to perform, to enact a dance of the dance between Krishna and the cow-herding women. And so in this instance, the setting gives us the clue. And here's another one, same type, where it's a big gathering and there are royals there. And clearly, you know, this is a dance for the royals. Then, how about this? This is the picture I put on the notice about this talk today. Are we positive that this figure is dancing? Well, here's a real Balinese dancer in something like this position, but he's sitting in a chair. This raises two questions. What about dance that doesn't involve the lower part of the body? I don't know, some of you will have to help me about this in India, whether this occurs in India or not. In Southeast Asia, it's pretty frequent that dancers sit on the floor and dance only with their upper body and their arms and their heads. They dance with their whole bodies too, of course, but there are times when they sit, and so their legs are not engaged, their lower bodies are not engaged in the dance. I hope some of you afterwards will tell me whether you know of this occurring in Indian dance traditions as well, but it is pretty common in Southeast Asia. So this comparison raises the issue of, is this guy dancing at the moment even though he's sitting in a chair? Well, maybe. There's a clear answer to the general question of whether the figure on the left is dancing or not, though, because there's an inscription on the painting that says it's a masked dance. So this is kind of trivial, but it's important to us sometimes to have a painting or another artwork that says on it in language what's going on. Or here's one, a 19th century photograph. Again, probably had to be staged, and these dancers are probably not at the moment in the process of dancing. They may well be just holding a pose for the photographer to be able to get the image. But the inscription in French tells us that it's dancers, and so there's no. If we had any doubt, the doubt is settled by the inscription. Then. There's the challenge of representations that look like they are of figures dancing, but they're not. So here's one where it seems to me we could perfectly well take this central figure as dancing, but he isn't. It's Krishna overcoming one of the animal demons that attack him at one time, and there's no reason to think that he's dancing. So if we know the story says it's not a moment of dancing, and therefore this pose, this position, this seeming movement that might suggest dance is in fact not dance. But, of course, if we keep in mind, and this is a basic one, that in Southeast Asia and in India too, sculptors and painters are looking at what dancers are doing, and dancers are looking at what sculptors and painters are doing. Maybe this sculptor, in depicting an incident that is not dance, is still inspired or has in the back of his or her mind dance performances that they've seen. Or here's a story, if we know the story, Balarama diverting a river. Looks perfectly well like he might be dancing, but he's not in the story. So there are instances where we're not sure whether a figure is dancing, and then there are instances where we're pretty sure that even though it looks like it's dancing, it probably isn't dancing exactly. So here's some puzzles, and I don't know the answers to these, and if any of you have some good thoughts or evidence for me, I'd be grateful. This is a work in our own collection. Dancing or not, I'm not sure. dancing or just moving in a kind of very vigorous way, expressing distress, or expressing, I don't know what, can be expressed by this, and the legs far apart, but it's not clear to me one way or the other whether we're to understand this as dance or some other kind of activity. Woman in a pose of romantic longing. Is this a dancer expressing romantic longing, or is it a regular person expressing romantic longing through her body language? So it is dance or it isn't dance. What do you think? I don't know the answers for these. So to wrap up, I just wanted to show you a couple of images that are not problematic, I think, and not religious and filled with potential ambiguity. There's certainly plenty of representations of dance just for the sheer fun of it, or so it seems. Look at these guys. We don't know of anything in particular that's going on here other than musicians and dancers kind of rocking out. So here's some clues that I have been able to come up with for thinking about whether a particular visual representation is definitely of dance or not. These are the ones that I've been able to isolate so far. And then I wanted to remind you of a couple of basic points: that dance obviously relates to, imitates, takes inspiration from, and also inspires other kinds of activities, either in regular everyday activities or artistic activities. And then the one that I have repeated a couple of times, which is that performing artists and artists working in static visual mediums and forms are looking at we presume, looking at each other's work all the time. So there's back and forth going on all the time. And then just to finish, this is the last slide, to finish up, to zoom way out, way back, and think about the biggest implications of these questions about movement and not movement, dance and not dance, stillness. We know that, of course, stillness has a very important place in dance performance too. A basic dichotomy, a basic pairing in Indian and Southeast Asian art is between the static and still, which is associated in literature and the arts with the eternal and the unchanging. So when we see a deity standing straight up like this with no flexion of the body, very formal, very symmetrical, and so on, that's the deity in the most abstract, permanent, unchanging, eternal form. And then the same deity as here, because both of these are Vishnu, as you know, both of these are forms of Vishnu, then when that eternal, static, permanent, absolute needs to do something in the cosmos, it moves. And the movement, the dynamism of the movement is associated with the particular, in the sense of the particular as opposed to the eternal. So the eternal is unchanging and permanent. The particular is momentary. That doesn't mean it's unimportant, but it exists in time as opposed to the internal, which exists outside of time. So these two principles of the unmoving, permanent, absolute, and the dynamic, moving, changing form that does things. The still form doesn't do things. It just is. So it is being. It's existing. When something needs to happen, then there has to be movement, and the movement has to do with dynamism and creation and destruction, and all of the change and activity that characterizes the world. So thank you very much, everybody.